Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Marie Myung-Ok Lee to discuss The Evening Hero, published by our friends at Simon & Schuster. Marie Myung-Ok Lee's young adult novel, Finding My Voice, is considered to be the first contemporary set YA with an Asian protagonist. She has written for the New York Times, Slate, The Guardian, The Nation, the Paris Review, and Salon. She teaches fiction at Columbia, where she is writer in residence. The essay series that she did for Slate on treating her son with autism using cannabis was featured in Dr. Sanjay Gupta's CNN series, Weed. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by John Darnielle, the author of 3 best-selling novels, Wolf in White Van, which was a National Book Award nominee, Universal Harvester, a finalist for the Locus Award, and his most recent, Devil House, published in January this year. He's the writer, composer, guitarist, and vocalist for the band The Mountain Goats. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Evening Hero from Books and Books using the link below. And we thank you for supporting indie bookstores everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello and welcome.
Hi,
Hey,
Christina. Hi,
how's it
John.
going? Hi, Maria. How's it going?
Pretty good. You guys, you look so bright.
Yeah, it's the south, but also I'm facing a pretty bright sky, or there's one behind me. How has your week been so far?
I go out to dinner with friends and then I find out an awful shooting has happened. So
No,
I'm
it's the
kind of
worst.
in this weird space right now. And
Yeah, no,
yeah,
it's common to ask when these things happen. I know how it feels to think, how is my thing I've been waiting for a long time to happen actually important at this time, right?
yes, it's 18 years. It's like a child, but somehow there are other important things going on. But I'm so grateful that you're between your tour and joining me here.
Oh, I
And
wouldn't miss it. I don't have introductory remarks, but I can ad lib some. So here's the Evening Hero by Marie Myung-Ok Lee, who I have known for a while. Just we befriended each other on social media, and we've never actually met face to face. But that's we're that sort of relationship, and it was tweets I have enjoyed, and anyway on
tweets I
Facebook.
love.
And she hit me up a while back about doing this and sent me the book. Um, you know. Uh, Once you've written some books, you get sent a lot of books. It can be hard to move one to the front of the queue, but it got there. And I want to say, I don't read a lot of books by people who are writing in English or by people who are still alive, right? If I'm reading people who are still alive, they're usually originally written in other languages. Literature and translation is my passion, right?
Ah,
But I moved this up, and I have to share with you all that this is a wonderful book, and it will really it's a captivating, it's an amazing brisk read, but it also circles a lot of ideas that are very present in our daily conversation, and sometimes sublimated in our daily conversation about the immigrant experience, also about aging. Um, and but I think if you had to ask me what the book is about, I would say that the theme, I wouldn't say the stealth theme, but the one that doesn't really announce itself until the middle of the book, is abandonment, right? Which is an idea we don't really center in our daily discussion because it feels abstract, but obviously it's not if you have some abandonment issues. And a lot of those are extraordinarily present in the immigrant experience, right? You
yes.
necessarily, if you immigrate, you have to abandon something. There's a lot of this stuff around this book. All that sounds really heavy, but it's also what the English would call a cracking story. It is a book that when you read it, you see the movie happening and you hope that somebody buys the rights and makes a good movie out of it, right? Although obviously it's a complicated question because makes a movie is one thing, makes a good movie is another thing, right? So I'm very curious. It's a big book. This is I would hazard a guess. I didn't count the pages, but this is the biggest thing you've essayed yet, yeah?
It's about 450 pages, but when my agent sold it, it was 850 pages.
Wow. You had to do a
Well,
lot of work.
It's slightly based on Middlemarch, like The Small Village, The Doctor.
Right. Oh,
Middlemarch
amazing.
is about 850 pages. Oh, and by the way, this book is also not small.
No,
This
that
book
was
is
one
not
of my goals
small.
in writing it. I wanted to write a big book because I usually write books that are very compressed, right? And I wanted to challenge myself to see what does more leisurely, what kind of issues, what kind of questions do you wind up posing over the course of a longer book? And it was very instructive to me.
And I should note, I actually feel like now, because I was reading the book more for this, and I really feel like our books are in conversation with each other, sort of the anatomy of life, and just also lots of switches. And then I noticed in the week, for I think it was like the 6 best books of 2022, I noticed number
We're
like
both on that
3
list.
and
I saw that list.
4. Where,
Saw
yeah,
that list
you
too.
me,
I was
dude.
pretty stoked about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing we share is that, I mean, we're both writing literary fiction, right? But also both trying to write books that are very readable. And often people doing literary fiction make a bargain and say, look, I'm ready to write for a smaller audience to be a more literary writer. I'm a rock singer. I know what it feels like to reach all 2,000 people in a room. And I want to do that when I write. I want everyone to be able to enjoy my book, both the people who are tracing metaphors and deeper issues and just the people who came to read a story. I think that's doable because I think the 19th century writers teach us this. You mentioned George Eliot, also Melville, also Hardy. All these writers are writing deep books, but you can also just read as a story. In the case of Hardy, only if you want to cry, right? But your book is it addresses a bunch of big questions I hope to get into momentarily here, but I feel like the readability, the humor in the book, the relatability of your characters. Tell me about your characters. Talk to me about, I mean, it's a dumb question, but your main character is a middle-aged doctor, right? In northern
Elderly,
Minnesota.
actually. Unless you consider
Elderly.
he used to be middle-aged, yes. Maybe you're
So,
expanding
well,
your
middle-aged
position
because they're too close to my age.
middle age just goes up to like 90.
But he's not technically retired yet when we meet him, right?
Correct, because private equity has ruined his hospital, and he still has a lot of life in him.
Talk to me about Dr. Kwok, and talk to me about the relationship between your own life and the hospital issues, which like resonated very strongly with me. I used to work in medicine.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, my father is also a physician.
I was there when private healthcare took over psychiatry.
Oh, okay. Well, because what's funny is when I did one of my NPR interviews, they said they did a story about this in 2012 about this is what's going to happen when private equity infiltrates healthcare. And they said, your book is an example of exactly what's going to happen. Because, we kind of think of medicine as, it's always there for you. It's there to help you. Women should always have a place to have a baby. So Young-man is this guy in his 70s. He has the job that no American doctor wants because the obstetrician, he's on call all the time. No American doctor wants this, but he's there for everybody's labors. He's ready to work, and he's just kind of turned 75 before he's realized what's happened. But then one day it turns out private equity has decided to, through mergers and consolidation, just to buy a bunch of hospitals and put them out of business.
Yeah. Which is a real thing.
It is not only a real thing. I grew up in a similar mining town in northern Minnesota, and there is a situation now that you have to drive 100 miles to have your baby, and nobody cares if you don't have a partner, or it might not be safe for you to drive.
Or you can't afford to have 3 or 4 nights in a hotel ahead of the birth, and you don't want to be driving once the contractions start, right?
Exactly. You think there's a social contract to have a hospital, but no, actually, and a lot of people don't understand that maternity is the loss leader of the hospital. It doesn't make money for the hospital, but it's the introduction to the brand. I did a lot of research, and I actually majored in economics, and I'm very interested in like late stage capitalism, which I feel like a lot of your books are also reflective of that. So Young-man is sitting around going, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? And at the same time, his son, Einstein, whom he's groomed to be the next generation, but then somehow Einstein's gotten away from him and
he grew up here.
Yeah. He's joined this bro startup that's in the Mall of America. And he somehow kind of cons Young-man into, Young-man thinks he's going to be giving people vaccines, but he ends up depilating vaginas for minimum wage. And so Young-man feels like there must be more to life, but he wants to keep busy. His wife is checked out. She's become this Korean nationalist, going to the Korean church. He also when the day he loses his job, these strange letters start coming from Korea. And we slowly start to understand that he has a secret of something he did as a child that he wanted to leave behind. And like many immigrants, he feels like coming to America is a clean slate. but he realizes somebody back there still knows his secret. And could he just continue to live and let the secret just live with him until he dies, which is the easier thing? Or could he face what he should face? And that's the big question. And for the readers, you will know what the secret is by the end, in case you don't like cliffhanger or what. Sometimes books just kind of bloop. But
yeah, no, I have a tendency to make the answer something that doesn't actually answer the question of the secret. But your book satisfies. In that way, it's the 19th century that you tie up the ends.
I'm a big Dickens fan too, so I think there is this kind of accretion of energy that has to be released at the end.
Yeah, you're also very good at doing in the Dickensian way of dropping one thread and picking up another, but they wind up braiding, right? They wind up intersecting in really fun ways. I'm going to go to the questions I wrote so I don't wind up talking over you a lot, which is a flaw of mine. I'm a performance. So here's something. When people summarize what my books are about, I often flinch and I think there's more to it than that. But when I try to summarize them myself, if I go longer than one sentence, I feel like I'm just trying to tell the story rather than distill it. So for me, my first novel is about a game designer who comes to better understand the nature of his work. What for you is the core of what The Evening Hero is about?
Wow. Well, one of the reasons it has taken me 18 years to write.
Questions, so I worked really hard at my questions.
I know. So I'm going to try to distill it into
a paragraph.
Because the book was kind of done in its Middlemarchish way, but then 2016 happened, and I just felt like as a writer, satire goes out the window because you need access for satire. Right. So the book kind of became rewritten. It used to be more Einstein's Middlemarchy, trying to succeed, and the dad was more. But then the core of the book became, sadly, because even seeing people in my hometown calling for genocide of North Koreans because they were kind of they were kind of just parroting Trump's "let's bomb North Korea" rhetoric.
Those scenes are vivid in this book, very vivid. The signs in the yards, the sort of traumatizing feeling of that nationalism that just bubbled up to the surface,
Right. Whereas the person who saves the lives in the town, whether it could be my father, who was born in Pyongyang, unlike Youngman, who was born in a tiny village, to see that he's a small Asian man to your random American observer, particularly your racist observer, who has this epic story behind him. So I think that ended up becoming more of a motivator. It seems simplistic. I just wanted to tell the story of a man who looks like a little Asian guy, but he's got this epic story and he has this opportunity for growth. And can you find meaning that late in life? That's the question. You have to read to find out.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, really one of the very beautiful things about this book is, and the word representation is used so much that it's it loses much potency. But as you know, both my children are Hapa, right? They're a quarter Thai, right? And this is something for a white guy you start thinking about when you're married, but as soon as the children are born, like suddenly you think really hard about it. You start thinking about their situation, which is like, you shouldn't have to have children to actually be engaged with these issues, but it engages you at a very primal level because you're the father, right? And then you think a lot about it and how representation is powerful. Like I went to see that Everything Everywhere All at Once movie recently. Yes. Oh my God. I mean, the audience was like 3/4 Chinese, which you don't normally see in Durham, right? And I was just in tears at how beautiful it was. Everybody turning out for the movie that's something Walter Chaw talks about. It is like the representation value of that film is just breathtaking. It's like, it's a cool movie that everyone who watches it is going to have to admit that it kind of got them, It's so,
right. It's so original. But it captures the immigrant experience.
To be such a relatable character. I mean, he's elderly, so a lot of people who are younger will struggle to see, it's like that's a bridge for some people. But other than that, his concerns, he's acclimated. He's been in America long enough that he's a recognizable American guy, a guy who works some jobs like you and I, and struggles with issues of consolidation and feeling valuable in your workplace and stuff like that. And that's a super valuable representation point. I think it's fair to say, I wrote in my notes that most white Americans know very little about Korea, North or South, right? The literary marketplace, whatever gains it's made in recent years toward more diverse perspectives, remains fairly narrowly focused with regard to whose stories get told, whose worlds get described, which trains are going by, what
atmosphere.
assumptions we all have going into a story. Writing a story of Koreans in North America whose stories are only really knowable in the context of Korean history. How did you feel writing that? Did you feel pressure, or were you excited to share stuff, or challenged in some specific ways about what to include and what to leave out? Can you talk about knowing that you're going to be part of the representation story when you write a book? Right?
That's a beautiful question, because one of the things is I wanted to make sure, first, I kind of wanted to decenter the Korean War part from just what we know with textbooks, because even Ken Burns did something on Vietnam and he got the line wrong. It's the military demarcation line. He had the 30th parallel comparing to Vietnam. So, you know what I mean? Like, that's so easily checkable. But a lot of people feel like North Korea. I know, right? Some grad student. But, you know, like North Korea and South Korea have always existed in most people's minds, and North Korea is evil, as opposed to, no, actually the US split it. And the Koreans were ready to go and re-govern their country, but the US occupied the South, and then the Russians occupied the North. And then what I wanted to do is everything that is in the book is verifiable. For instance, like the movie, The Great Escape, I made sure that that movie was playing somewhere in Korea, so Young-man could have seen it with his wife. But then there are all these like beautiful little parallel, like little messages I got that I kind of felt like the ancestors told me, yeah, you're totally on the right track here. Because one, it turned out recently that Bong Joon-ho, the director of A Parasite, that was his like seminal movie when he was 13, is The Great Escape.
Wow.
That made him want to be a filmmaker. And then the other like kind of weird loop on this is when I was starting to do a lot of oral histories, a lot of people said, yeah, stuff would fall in the sky and people would have convulsions and seizures. And I vaguely would hear stuff, but then the CIA would be, oh, no, we never use biological weapons. We never do a thing like that. That's all you hear, you know? And then Nicholson Baker wrote this book on FOIA. And one of the things he was FOIA-ing was stuff about the Korean War. They use biological weapons. So I showed him a part of my book. And he's like, this matched up with all my FOIA stuff. Like, how did you know that? I said, I did not know that. I just asked people. But then what's very weird is if you watch Bong Joon-ho's Godzilla movie, The Host. I don't know if you remember this scene, but there's this very weird crowd scene where they're demonstrating, and then there's like this voice going, don't worry, everything's fine. You need to disperse. It's like this kind of pleasant voice, but then there's gas coming out, and all these people are having seizures. It looks exactly like how I saw it in my book. And then I'm realizing, oh, you know what? For Koreans, because they lived through the war, this is just part of their cultural memory. It's not, it's secret. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's just making me realize, oh no, I'm just an American. So I think this is all secret and it probably didn't happen. But then in Korea, this is just like, oh no, because so many of the people I interview are like, oh yeah, this weird powder came out. Or they were trying to like poison the crops. Yeah. So we didn't have anything to eat. And so just the cultural memory. So I kind of tried to be the best vessel for this. So I don't want anyone to read it and think, oh, Marie just made this up. No, this took me 18 freaking years, including when I started writing about North Korea. I had to get there and go to Kaesong, that place where there's, in the book, where there's a place where the Koreans finally relaxed and kind of hung out together, North and South. And a lot of the people, it was kind of a child army, but so was the US Army. People were like 18, 19, 17. That place is real. It really happened.
You're one of the only journalists allowed inside the North. I mean, the number is extremely small, right?
Not only is the number really small, is they don't let diaspora Koreans, we're called Kyopo, they don't let us in because if North Korea was so great, the existence of diaspora Korean kind of puts a lie to that. So what happened was I was teaching at Brown at the time, and a bunch of students who were taking Chinese history, they found a fixer in China who would take them into North Korea, and they needed a faculty advisor. So I volunteered, and so did this white guy who did Japanese history. But then this is also when Kim Jong-il was doing all this stuff with the Taepodong. That was like the missile exploding. That guy sensibly, especially when the State Department told us not to go, he sensibly said, I am not going. And so I was the one who was left. And so it was up to the students to figure out how to get me on the group visa without unduly mentioning that I was Korean.
Right. Yeah.
So they did by going through a much smaller consulate. And then I did the very inadvisable thing, because my mother was also born in North Korea, bringing my mother along, she's a bit of a loose cannon. We had many rules to follow, many of which she broke. So
Wow.
I'm actually really happy I'm speaking to you now and not on the gulag, and I'm not exaggerating. So,
Yeah. No, but having said that about North Korea, there was one thing I was very excited to read this because most stories Americans hear about North Korea concern the government, and they're presented in the bleakest terms imaginable, right? And I feel like North Korea gets uniquely singled out for this sort of Western gaze framework, which is not
exactly.
to say that I think they have an awesome government or anything.
Right.
But when you hear these stories, they approach this comic level of like, like whatever you can say about the leaders, the way that the American press presents them and winds up putting into the spin is really dehumanizing. It's like I said something about this earlier on Facebook. It's like it was very normal when I was a teenager for white comedians to have a section of their bit that was about eating at a Chinese restaurant where they do an accent and screw up their eyes and stuff. And I get that vibe from when they talk about North Korea. So I don't have a question here, but I wanted to say is like, to have a book in which the people of the North have lives of their own and are living and are coping with whatever the facts of their government are, because as Americans, we are also coping with the facts of a government that's kind of weird in a lot of ways, right? So, but we present ourselves as complex 360-degree people, whereas when people talk about North Korea, I was happy to have North Korea presented as a place where people exist. You know what I mean? It's like I said, I don't have a question, but I think it's a really, it's a great thing you're doing.
Well, I have a comment to your question, to your non-question, because I was thinking about when my mother, so immigration is not just old country, new country. My mother had to escape from North Korea during 45 when the US partitioned. And then
Right.
she was 14 and helped her aunt who was divorced and had nothing to lose. They had to go over these mountains. I'm pretty sure she was sexually assaulted, but she won't talk about it. But just her
There's
the way
some powerful scenes in the book about that. Very
yeah,
powerful. And not vividly or triggeringly portrayed, but incredibly emotional, resonant moments with Youngman's mother.
well, but like similarly, which what I know from talking to people, you're sitting here like you're sitting like where you are. And what if you had to decide, are you going to immigrate to Mexico or not? Because for them, they were like, well, the Russians supposedly rape all the grandmothers, but then the Americans are like equally brutal, and you're kind of like, but I'm already here. Do I really want to go there? You don't know what it's going to be like in the South, and it's completely irreparable. And so for my mom, her family was supposed to come over the next day, and they did not. The border was closed. So she's always had these problems with decisions, even though that was the correct decision. Yeah. So similarly for the book, you can make all the correct decisions and still just be sad and lonely and be in a split family. So that's kind of also what I was trying to hope to get to, that it's much more complex. Like, oh, I'm in the South, I'm fine.
Well, that's a super complex point from a narrative standpoint generally. Like if we momentarily table some of the real world concerns and say, in a lot of stories, especially a lot of American stories, the notion is that your choices lead you either to the victory or the loss, right? But to tell a real story means it's not victory and loss happens in sports, right?
Exactly. It's just,
and otherwise you have mixed outcomes. You have, and that's
right.
a very, I mean, I think in a sense, it's a very non-American story to tell, is one with mixed outcomes, right? One
exactly.
where you notch a couple W's and you try not to carry your L's too hard, right?
And I would think that people would look at Youngman and say, he's the immigrant success story. His son went to Harvard. He's a doctor. He's had a very nice life. But that's, yeah, it's a little bit about.
Although that's part of why I love that it's set in northern Minnesota, because I think, the readership necessarily is not going to be largely northern Minnesotan, right? And so I think when most people contemplate living in a place like that, where you have to think about the weather more than anything else, right? And the two restaurants that you can that are accessible, it's like he's chosen a remote place to be, but I don't know how much it shows that. Speaking of which, like I don't recall how that winds up where he lands after Alabama, but it makes me wonder. People talk about process in writing a lot. It's one of my bugbears. Is like the first question is, tell me about your creative process, which I consider such a loose question. But when you started writing this 18 years ago, we should say, did you start with the story? Did you have an arc there? Or did you have an idea instead of a story? Or did you have the character? Where's the germ of this?
Aha. So generally when I write, I usually have like one weird dot in the horizon that I'm writing towards, but I'm not quite sure what it is.
So toward, not from, but toward.
Yeah. Like I can just barely see this dot and what I thought the dot was at the time was it was kind of inspired by a story a doctor told me about his colleague who was an OBGYN. He saved a woman who had placenta previa. There's actually still a little remnant of that in there. And even though he saved her,
In the part where they're talking about eating placenta?
No, actually about the part where he gets sued despite doing the good job. So it's a similar Middlemarch thing where the guy's trying to do the right thing. He masterfully saves her, but because he had to remove her uterus so she would not bleed to death, she was able to sue him for loss of fertility. So then, I kind of get this what if feeling, like what if he was Asian and they use more Asian tropes? Like he's the Asian butcher, Asians don't revere life. Like, would that be an easier way? So that dot that I was writing to was trying to put actually Einstein into this thing and wrote toward it. So, I did all this research. I saw a medical malpractice trial. Like I had to like practically bribe the clerks to tell me when a trial was coming, and I would talk to that doctor in the bathroom. So I wrote toward that. It was done. It wasn't quite the right. Henry James said the house of fiction has one door and many windows. So like,
yeah.
that window. So it was kind of thrashing around and then I got the Mall of America. And I was kind of like Einstein's kind of doing this thing. And so you saw like there's a little bit of that fragment of that in the novel, but it wasn't. And then the story became Einstein is going to do all this. And the Mall of America, and then he's going to fail spectacularly and probably commit suicide. It was much grimmer, actually. That one didn't work. Yeah, so I can't. And then finally, again, in 2016, this sounds so egotistical, but I wanted to write a big social novel. I wanted to be the woman who writes like a Jonathan Franzen type. It's in the Mall of America, late stage capitalism. Not the immigrant story. Like, keep me away from immigrants.
In the Mall of America. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But then Jungmann really just kind of came out of the book and was.
Yeah.
When I finally told my agent,
because you were talking about ancestral stuff earlier, and that is a case where you had a centered son, and you wind up looking at the father, right? That's
yes.
That too is kind of 19th century. It's kind of Trollope-like, right? That the young people who are motivating things wind up in conversation with their elders, right?
And maybe it was good because I wasn't looking at Jungmann super carefully, so I was less self-conscious about what I wanted to do. Do you know what I mean?
How long did it take until? How long of these 18 years we're talking about? How long are you focused on Einstein? Again, if you haven't read the book, the son of Jungmann, who is the immigrant. So he's the American-born son of an immigrant doctor, and he's raised, with high expectations to become successful, right? Although Jungmann is trying hard not to be hammering the expectations as hard as fathers often will want to. Especially immigrant.
He's a tiger dad, though. He's still tiger dad.
Yeah, he is. I feel like he's conscious. It's like I don't. Yeah. It sounds like he, especially in his old age, he's reflecting on his tiger dad tendencies.
And he's trying not to be a tiger dad as the way he was raised. But it was kind of like, so it was kind of like, first it was like mostly Einstein's story, and then occasionally I'd like, he needs a backstory. Here's Jungmann's story, and then slowly it became like both. But then I got trapped in this thing where my editor's sort of like, well, if you're going to do Einstein, you have to do a Jungmann chapter. If you do a Jungmann chapter, and I was kind of like, I find myself like, when you get that feeling like dutifully writing these chapters so they're symmetrical.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I do.
I was like, this bullshit. Excuse my language. And so finally I told my agent, I was like, this was probably about 5 years ago. I was like, well, she and I are both really into horses. And so I used a horse metaphor. I said, when you ask the horse to canter, it has to go on a lead. Like one leg goes more than the other leg. And I said, I don't know what's going on, but I feel like Jungmann is the lead leg on this. And I feel the story. I just said, how would you feel if I just told it from his point of view, but kind of in a close third that kind of goes in and out?
Yeah.
That's good, agent. She said, yeah, try it. I support you.
So you mentioned your editor, and here's this inside baseball process stuff that I suspect people who haven't yet written their books would also be interested in. How much do you show to you over the course of 18 years? Did you have the same editor the whole time?
No, I've had many editors, and everyone's like, wait, what? One of the reasons I never got an MFA, besides financial reasons, was I don't do well when my stuff's at a germinative stage. I hear people going, no, do this, or why don't you do this? I did not show it to anyone, including my husband. My husband actually, at your publisher, my husband used to be an editorial assistant. So he's a very good editor. Yeah. $12,000 a year. That was a little hard for him. But he,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like, he has those chops. So he's my first and best reader. And also he's great because if he's ever like, ugh, it's not working. I know it's not working, but if he feels like it's working, it's working. I didn't show it to him for 5 years. I didn't show anyone anything.
And so how far along are you by the time you show somebody something?
I have to have a whole draft done and have
You have
worked
a full
on
draft
it.
before you share it. Yeah,
Oh
I'm the same
dear. Usually it's a full draft and I've thrown it away. And I handwrite. You know what? Do you see all those notebooks back
really?
there? Dude, I handwrite. And then
You
there's
handwrite.
there's a
Everybody
special
look behind her at those binders.
Those are
It's
mostly-
handwritten.
those are mostly
You really are
notebooks.
19th century. You're the
And
real
I
deal.
love I found these notebooks in Mexico that have the spirals on the top so I could flip them faster. And they
Oh, yeah,
were
those are
like
cool.
hard. And so I would try to buy some. And if people went to Mexico, I'm like, if you find these notebooks. Yeah. So first, and then I type it all in, and then have a draft and work in the draft. And I normally actually throw it away because it's all weird. And then, but then I know it well enough that from the intros, I try to get something going.
Fascinating. So, but you don't share. Your husband, I assume, hears some extracts and sees a little bit along the way. No, you work in total secret until you have something done.
It's just it feels like, you know, like you're a turtle without a shell. I don't know. Do you feel that when you're writing music?
I do is the thing. I won't show my editor a draft until I'm done, right? Because in part though, because I usually don't have my ending planned, and so I don't.
Right.
You know, like with Devil House, there was a bunch that I threw away midway through. I realized a thing. And I threw tons away, right? So I didn't want to be getting excited because my wife had read some of the parts I wound up throwing away, and she was mad that those were gone because they were powerful sections, right? And so that's why it's like, well, we can get over that inside the house, but an editor is going to go, oh no, I have to publish this part that's good. So
Was that interesting?
And they were complete. I mean, there was a whole different murder arc. It took place in a different part of the country. It was a whole thing. So. So that is super interesting, but you don't show anybody until you get a full draft done, and you write in longhand. Oh, and there was another question I had about the 19th century connection, which I love so much, because here's the thing. When many people read George Eliot or Melville or Trollope or Dickens is the one who most people will find readable the quickest, right? It's like,
yes,
if you
definitely
start reading Dickens, inside of a chapter or two, he'll get you, right? And I don't care what your background is. Dickens is such a master that you go, okay, I got it. The only problem will be if you're reading Oliver Twist, then suddenly you go, why am I reading all these anti-Semitic tropes? I don't like it. You know, and so again, that's very real. But otherwise, Dickens is fully going to reel you in. The others, the degree of resistance is generally fairly strong. You have to agree to be in the 19th century, whether you're reading Virginia Woolf, whether you're reading whoever, Jane Austen. You know, but your book is doing similar things. And landing the way that it would have landed on a 19th century reader, which is to say, it's in a world we recognize. We're seeing a lot of these things. And coming around to my question, feeling some of the same things, some of the same powerlessness and anger and rage at some of the same things. And I want to talk about how this is a light book, like a 19th century book. It reads lightly. It barrels forward. It's a page turner. Right, it's like it really. You think you're done reading for the night, and you read a couple more chapters because it's such a good story, you know. But underneath all that, there's pockets of rage. I feel right, and I want to talk about the relationship between the tones. I want you to talk about the relationship between the tones and how you chose to sort of parcel that out. Like I feel some that I think will be unrecognizable to a lot of white readers in the meeting at the pastor's house. Right. And I feel some toward the way that body standards have risen in the job you give Dr. Kwok in his old age at the clinic. And I feel a great deal, of course, for the way that Korea was partitioned, you know, and for the lives that disrupted. And for me, especially, I noted like toward medical, the direction of medical care in the country that is, in fact, where the greatest amount of good medical care ought to be available to the most people, and is instead essentially an economic meritocracy, right? So talk about the balance of rage and humor, of story, and having a moral point in this book.
Well, one thing is, I really wanted to make war funny. Not funny, but I'm glad you picked up on the humor, because
there's a lot of good laughs in this book. Out loud laughs. Read to your wife laughs.
Koreans are actually, despite stereotypes, very funny. If you've ever seen a Korean zombie movie, like Train to Busan. There's like in a George Romero movie, it's always grim. But in a Korean movie, someone's gonna do something stupid and get eaten by a zombie because they did something stupid.
It's true. Although the Korean director I've seen the most things by is what's his name? The guy who did Old Boy.
I was gonna say Chan-wook. Yeah.
Yeah, and most of those movies are fairly devoid of humor. By the end, they have erased the humor for you. Like simply.
No, those are completely grim. But they're on their kind of old. They're more metaphorical. Also, like he did The President's Last Bang, which is about like dictatorship, and then he's assassinated another dictator. It's hard to do that funny, I guess.
Yeah.
And but I I had this idea where like I'm kind of doing like a reverse Chekhov, because how in Chekhov you kind of have like the happy story, but you feel there's the pain underneath, sort of like a sub rosa pain. But I actually wanted to have the pain on the top and then kind of the joy underneath.
That's a very Russian conflict, actually. I mean, Tolstoy is very similar, that like there's this angst, but he's trying to tell a really ripping yarn. He's trying to make sure you're reading his big book, right? So he's trying not to make you feel all that right away. He's waiting until you're in,
Right. And how else do you express, like you just saw everything everywhere all at once? Like, how do you express trauma? Trauma's not like, oh, I'm triggered by this gun. It reminds me of the war. That's not how trauma works. It's Young-man going nuts at the party with the church people.
Oh, so
that's the trauma. Or just him like, I don't know, like hating Einstein when Einstein doesn't go to church school while he actually agrees with him for not going to church school on Wednesday with public funds. So it's just this kind of nutty rage while he thinks of himself as being really calm and proper.
Yeah. There's stuff he's been carrying for a long time. It's part of what's so powerful about this book is that instead of just dumping all that on the reader, which is an option you have as a writer, you can begin from inside of somebody's id and just spew all that out. But instead, we see him the way we would see him in the world first. We meet him as a person, and then we learn what's inside, right? I think it would be a great time if you read something and shared something from the book with us.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna do, so as you know, the tone does kind of go all over the place. So I'm gonna read a little bit of, this is the middle of the war and what's happened to Young-man's family. He's like 12, 13. He just turned 13. And they've been pushed to what's called the Busan perimeter. That's when the war was looking pretty crappy. Like the North Koreans had pushed everyone except for this tiny part in Busan. So you think everyone would be super worried about the war, but Young-man, being a kid, is actually more worried about getting into college. So he's trying to think if there's a way he can sneak into the these classes that are still being held, because yes, Koreans are tiger people in general, at this train station. So he sees the signs. It's Eagle High School, meet at the east end of the train station. Eagle High School was famous for having the most alumni admitted to Seoul National University. Young-man wasn't even of age to be admitted, but here in the topsy-turvy world of Busan, maybe he could use the wartime chaos to his advantage. He walked the 100 meters to the Busan train station. There were two groups sitting outside, unshielded from the elements. Both were groups of boys with close-shorn hair, but from the East End, instead of tattered refugee rags, many were dressed in navy jackets with white shirts. The teacher wore a Western suit and tie, the first yangbok Young-man had ever seen. But the teacher stood in the same beating sun, the same clouds of dust and exhaust from the train as the students. There were maybe 40 of them, not an anonymous crowd, but not an intimate handful either. There was even a blackboard. The students used the respectful sir as if they were back in the classroom. Young-man had no idea what was going to happen next. Sorry, it's a little dark in here. If he entered the group, well, my building faces a wall, so it gets dark. And if he entered the group from the back, the teacher might not see him. Then again, he might. The students would surely know he didn't belong. What would happen? Would he be beaten? He took a breath and slid into the group. A boy immediately turned and glared, mouthing, "Scram!" But Young-man stood still, holding his gaze. The boy scowled and humphed, and then actually made room for him to sit. Young-man returned the next day. A few boys stared, but he stared haughtily back like fallen royalty with a confidence he hadn't known he had. On the first rainy day, of which there would be many during the monsoon season, they moved to a church. Young-man walked in to find every inch of the vestry filled. First rule, no one was allowed to lie on the altar. Dense with refugees, the air humid with human sweat stink, hair oil, and farts. In this limited space, the boys noticed and grumbled when Young-man pushed in. That one is not a classmate. Once, during math, a teacher threw him out as an imposter. But most were too careworn to notice. 5 at a time, crowded a lot around a single slate or textbook. As the days wore on, fewer bothered to wear a uniform. One boy even had a younger sibling strapped to his back who was always crying or shitting in his diaper. He drew more ire than Young-man. Many were malnourished and small, all of them straining to hear the English teacher over the din of the train. "Hello, how are you?" the teacher said, and put a hand to his ear, waiting for a reply. Young-man couldn't help himself. Haraoji had made him learn some English, because it may be useful one day. He stood up. "I'm fine, and you?" he practically shouted. The boys all laughed derisively. He was supposed to have repeated, "Hello, how are you?" Young-man reddened and sat down. "Student, what is your name?" said the teacher, looking at him hard. "Kwak Young-man, teacher, sir." The man frowned, puzzled, but then turned back to the makeshift blackboard and said, "Good job." Nobody questioned Young-man after that.
It's such a powerful, it's so Dickensian, that scene. It's really just, it's a very, it's a please sir, may I have some more kind of scene, right? So,
There's a sir even in, yes. Thanks.
no, I think the thing is, it's so, that's the pleasure of this book, and it's one thing I like so much about it, is that you have foregrounded the pleasure of reading and learning the story, right? Sometimes holding reveals back can feel like a contest with the reader instead of an enticement, But because you've written these characters who are so followable, and I know it's hard to respond to praise with anything but thanks, but it's true. It's like you get to know the character before you're asked to care about what their secrets are, And I think that's a bold choice, and a different choice than a lot of fiction makes. It's what lets your book stand apart. And another thing, share a section I found myself on page 157. Young-man always tried to picture his grandmother. She would have a wise, kind face like Halabuji's. She would put a hand to his cheek and say "Onya" when she was pleased with something he did. Beyond that, he couldn't picture her. Young-man's mother had told him she had died in childbirth. The son she was carrying had died with her. His father had been gone for 2 years by then. Young-man worried he would one day fail to picture him too. So this passage seems to be about memory, right? Which is important to everybody, and it's a big part of all of our stories. But I think it maybe has special weight if you are immigrant, right? Or if your connection to immigration is very close, right? So talk about memory in this book. Talk about the function of memory and how the various characters feel about it.
Well, for instance, when Young-man and his brother have to run over the parallel after the U.S. starts kicking them out because suddenly their village is in North Korea, even though it was in South Korea before, because they changed the line around.
Key word there. It happens very quickly, right?
Yes. They have to hurry and make a decision, but then also they have to figure out what they're going to pack, like what's important to them. But then because they're running away from these missionaries who are trying to grab them for adoption, they lose all their pictures.
Yeah.
And we're so like, oh, I could just look it up on Facebook again. Let me do Google Images. Can you imagine that, that happened to so many people, and there's so many separated families. There's actually separate Korean word for isan kajok. This gets separate word because there's so many people. So think of like being permanently separated from people whose pictures you don't even have, or you don't have pictures of yourself. Or like my mom, where when the doctors ask her, how old is she? We're always like, I'm not sure. And they're like, what kind of kids are you? But I'm like, no. In Korea, like you're a year old when you're born, and she wasn't sure about her papers. So it just sounds like we're stupid kids. But it's like, no, in Korea, she could be within 3 years. Like also on New Year's, you turn a year older too. So it's very complicated.
Oh, wow.
But doesn't it make sense? You're already a year old. You've been in the womb for almost a year. So
Sure. No, actually, when I first heard about that as a child, I loved it. I loved that you were 1 on your birthday because it makes sense to me. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things I remember hearing at about the age of 6 and going, oh, that's cool.
Right? And then also, I hope the book is also about how memory changes, where he has these ideas of what happened, but then he's seeing it also through other people's eyes and realizing maybe he wasn't quite the jerk that he thought he was, or that what all these failings that he thought he was weren't actually failings at all. And also, I think he becomes more forgiving to himself.
Well, that's one of the errands of adulthood, right? Is to forgive your younger self. And it's a very hard thing to do. And like, I'm always hesitant, like that feels very much like a sort of Western therapeutic value. And I'm always wanting to make sure to be conscious of like, well, that may be a value for us culturally, but like, but like also in Western therapy, to share your feelings is a big value. Well, that's not a universal value, right? It's like there's plenty of in which sharing your feelings is to center yourself to a really uncouth degree. And that's a fine value too, right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't find an outlet for your feelings somewhere. It's like that I think that is important. But I think the way that, especially the 80s, there was such a centering of like, no, you got to speak your truth right now. Like, I want to say, go to Thailand and do that. It's like, it's just not cool. It's like, there's a time and place. But at the same time, some of those values do eventually reach the universal of having to unburden yourself. And I think forgiving your younger self is one of those, that to understand that you didn't always know what you know now.
Right.
And to understand your own circumstances. And this figures hugely in Kwok's story, is his ability, you can feel his shame when he begins to get letters, right? You can feel that he hasn't yet addressed the distance between the self he once was and the self he becomes. Yeah, and I don't have a question in there, but I think the becoming of a self is something that the book addresses really stealthily. It's like that. What shapes, what are the things you think shape him along the way? Is I think the question I would have, like along the way from arrival in. Where does he originally dock? Is he works in Birmingham for a while, right?
Right. They come in through. They take a ship to California, and then they make their way to Birmingham, and then the only job he gets is in Minnesota. So he just basically, he's somehow also just kind of following like this current of history. And then what I like is he tries to sort of then later impose himself on his own history versus so much of what he's done, he's just been buffeted. But that's also like so many people who are caught in history. Like in America, we're just like, one day is like another, but that's not like that if you live in most places. You can't count on one day being like another.
Right.
And that's also a gift I feel like my parents gave us, is the gift of boredom. We had no idea that's
I miss boredom.
Right? You know what I mean? Like my mom really is so upset that she never got to graduate from college, where, I kind of feel like, well, you survived the war, but then that kind of informs some of the book, where just like the piece that I read where, you're not always going like, I'm surviving the war every day. You are going like, I'm worried, how am I going to get into college? And that's what Jungmann is doing. He's trying to figure out how he can like worm his way into this private school class. And are we supposed to ask people if they have questions?
I think we are. It's such a delight to talk to you about this book, but I think if somebody, we should open it up to questions, I think.
We should, but there aren't any in here yet. There are people watching. I think they're just like
shy,
dumbfounded by this amazing conversation. I mean, seriously. You guys but you got together. What a great dynamic. So I guess I love how you did the editor's voice. Can you do the editor's voice again? Marie, you did the editor's voice. Like,
what was
the voice
editor?
Of your editor.
Yeah, the voice of your editor. The voice of your editor was like really funny. Anyway.
Maria, the thing is, we are very well matched, because this happens to me all the time. Did I say a thing and it was good? Oh, cool. I'll watch the tape later.
No, John and I are very like, I'm Buddhist. Maybe you're kind of Buddhisty too. I'm very in the moment, and I'm kind of
Catholic,
just like rolling with it. And the funny thing, but one quote I do have to say, because my editor, Tim, his quote that everyone wants to use as shelf talkers is, "This book is effing funny." And he does.
Wait, is this Tim who used to be at Pantheon?
Yes.
Tim O'Connell?
Yes.
Oh, I love that dude to pieces.
Right?
I did 4 interviews on Wolf, and I always remembered sitting down with Tim, having such an amazing conversation about the first 6 chapters. You have, yeah, that's a great editor.
I'm really lucky. Yes. So he definitely picked up on the funniness, because I also feel that a lot of the tropes about Asian American literature too are, oh, it's all about the war, it's all serious. And so also when they were doing prototyped covers, a lot of them were super serious.
Yeah.
Like I felt like, wait, this book is funny. Like, you know what I actually wanted on the cover? You will appreciate it. Because ginseng is such a big theme. I actually wanted, sometimes they grow kind of priapically as they do the book.
Yeah.
I thought they
could
just
you're supposed to buy the priapic ones, right?
Yeah, because they have more value with the yang energy. So I kind of thought they could have a picture, maybe make it slightly more abstract, less obscene. That suggestion was not well received.
But I do love this about the question of the expectations on Asian American literature, because like this is a thing I've been thinking about for a long time. It's like, you know, it's something that I think is less foregrounded, is like, what are the American cultural expectations of how you are supposed to present as Asian American, what things you're sort of allowed to talk about. And allowed is a tricky word. Obviously, you can talk about whatever you like, but if you want attention, right, if you want to be in the conversation, there's an expectation. And I think it's the burden of representation, right? Which
definitely. Like pubic hair removal is not on that list.
Yeah, no, what other novels are there in English about the Korean immigrant experience? What to speak of the Korean immigrant experience of an older man, right? And a successful older man, but not riotously successful, just you know, practicing medicine in northern Minnesota. You know, it's like, it's one of the things that makes this book such a gift, you know.
Thank you.
I'm telling you, there are people watching, but there are no questions. So I think they're just enjoying the exchange between both of you.
That's okay. It's hard to formulate questions. It's a quick question.
It is. I wrote down Ozu and Kurosawa while I was listening.
Interesting.
You know, like, because can you find meaning late in life? It also made me think of Umberto De. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but okay, here's a question. It's about an older man who's like running around town. He's being evicted and he only has his dog Flag with him. But anyway, these are some of the things that I thought. So Liz says, you're doing great. We're paying attention.
Much appreciated.
Plus, Christina and I are dressed alike. See?
Yeah, you missed the memo about wearing pearls.
So I did have another. I had another structural question, which, like, as you know, if you read my most recent one, like structure. I mean, not just the most recent. Structure is a big question for me. I love to think about structures. You were saying about Buddhism. I'm Catholic. Like, structure for me is like, it's not the background, it's the actual center, right? So 2 of my 3 novels are partitioned, 1 into 4 parts, 1 into 7. I find that I grow especially attached to one part, that I come to think of the part as the part where the action is, right? As the sort of generative center of the book. There are 5 parts to Evening Hero. 3 of them are in Minnesota. 1's in something like the present. 3 in Minnesota, in something like the present, and 2 are in Korea. 1 in the past, 1 in the present. How do you think about the structure of this book? How did it change along the way? And which of these sections gave you the most pleasure to write? And which one sort of was the one you had to pound against the hardest?
Aha. I love that you asked this question. I always love the number 5 because there's like a middle and then there's 2 parts to it.
I love thinking about the numbers in the book that way. Okay. Yeah.
So but then also one of the arguments I got in with one of my editors, it wasn't Tim, but they kept asking me to write it linearly because that's more of a normal epic way of doing it. And there's other books like that. And I got really stuck on, no, like, he's immigrant, like, these things happen and these memories come out of nowhere. And I just the book made its own structure. And then finally I read Gish Jen's book, Tiger Writing, where she looks at like Easter narrative. And I'm like, oh, this is what I've been trying to do, but I didn't understand. So, you know, we're always taught like the Platonic, like the rising action, the climax, denouement, blah, blah, blah. That's what we're taught. But in Asian, like Eastern literature, often movement is generated by proximity, not necessarily action. So what I'm doing with the books is just the juxtaposition of the cuts back and forth generate, I hope, the movement. It's not necessarily like a plot. And then it's not necessarily supposed to be like, ooh, climax, duh. It kind of is 5 is also, to me, is like circular because you can't cut it in half and it's prime number. Like, so do you see what I'm saying? So no, none of, there was not a particular one that I loved more than another. It was just like, this was the order in which they needed to be so the energy would be generated. And they didn't do it consciously, but then luckily Gish-Jen made it so I could talk about it more articulately.
Yeah, that's super cool. I mean, to me, that's like such a, it's a question of shape, and a book's shape informs it so much. Well, we don't think that much about it while we're reading it. We follow the story, right? But the shape it tells us a lot about the book. And I do love the 5. My new one is 7, right? And everything's a mirror of everything else, and there's a thing in the middle that happens, right? So,
exactly. But that's so similar.
Yeah,
right?
It totally is. Because 5 and 7, they're neighbors, right? So,
yeah. Love it.
No, I love what you're saying. It's like I remember thinking, because I was doing all that before I even had the story finished. I was writing all this. We have a blackboard in the kitchen. I was like, okay, so the 1 and 7 have to be mirrors, and then I realized that a mirror only shows you something backwards, right? So
yes, no, exactly. Because I also want to mention, like, I loved hearing you read my book, and you're so good at narrator. I don't like audiobooks, but this book is so good in audio.
Well, I mean, I'm a musician. I'm used to performing. That's kind of it's my thing. And I also had a traumatic experience once of a teacher. I didn't want to share a story with a classroom, but she thought it was good, so she just started reading it, and I was mortified. I was like, no, it's not how it sounds in my brain, right? And it's like I got ran from the room. So it was 5th grade.
Funny.
So there's a great teacher who it was just that particular choice. I was like, so yeah, I mean, I think that actually informed, like, no, I have to do my own audiobooks. I don't think I can listen to somebody else reading it.
I love it.
Are you having an audiobook?
Yes. And I have a wonderful narrator named Raymond Lee.
Oh, cool.
And he's I didn't even audition anyone else. He was so perfect. And he'd done one book by David Yoon, and he was so perfect because he has this he read it in a kind of slightly awkward way, and the way he said his Korean was slightly awkward, purposely, I believe, because Youngman's Korean would indeed be slightly awkward after living in the US for 50 years, and he just had this, he's got a beautiful voice, and so happy. He's great.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
All righty.
So I have enjoyed this conversation so much. I'm not, if you have another question, go for it. I'm just coming back out just to remind people, if you have any questions, you can post them. But I think that, I think
2.5 minutes.
Yeah, we're not keeping time, but I think they're just engaged, like really engaged in the conversation. So I have a boring question for you, Marie. What's next after spending 18 years on The Evening Hero?
Oh my God,
I'm so glad you asked next.
I am so glad you asked me that. It's not boring at all. You know, it's kind of crazy. Well, I do have another YA novel coming out. It's called Hurt You, and it is a retelling of Mice and Men from a non-neurotypical Korean-American centered sort of contemporary setting. So instead of the bunkhouse, it's the Korean hagwon, the cram school, where all the weird interpersonal stuff happens. And the sister has a sibling who's non-neurotypical. So that's coming out next year. So that's not what I'm actually writing. I started writing a memoir that I've been working on for a couple of years. It's about my father and actually about incarceration, which is another surprising thing that's taken a while. And I'm probably about 3 years into it. But however, so people who know me, like John knows I have a son who has autism, and he's also has intellectual disability. For many years, they've been trying to institutionalize him, but we've managed to keep him home despite 3 very empathetic, enthusiastic tries to convince us that it was dangerous for us to have him home and he belonged in an institution. So strangely, this therapy that we've been doing forever without any kind of improvement, where we're trying to kind of go around his spoken language, because he speaks but it doesn't make any sense. If you ask him a yes or no question, he'll say yes once. You ask him the same question, he'll say no. You know, one day I was just kind of goofing around asking him, "You seem happier, like, how do you feel?" And he managed to like point to this letterboard and type out HOPE, hope. And this seems like a weird coincidence that he could actually spontaneous. But then he actually started getting better and better at it. And now he can type a little, and he's pointing at these things. And he's been able to tell me he wants to go on book tour with me. He has opinions on Ukraine. He said, I have been reading him age-appropriate literature for the last 10 years. While at school, they're reading like Goodnight Moon, but I'm reading him H is for Hawk. I read him Casey Lehman's book. Like, I read him really age-appropriate stuff. But he said that helped him learn how to read. He's an amazing speller. So strangely, what was kind of more of like a primal wound for my husband and me, because my husband's also a writer. He's a historian, that, we've never expressed to our son, but that, our son has a language problem, but now he wants to write a book. And this has only happened in the last couple of weeks. I'm telling you now, he's a beautiful writer. He wants to write a book.
Oh my God. That's fantastic. Have you ever connected to David Mitchell at all?
I wrote about him in a piece I did for the New York Book Review about how angry I am about how when people use autism as a shortcut. And yes, and he actually helped that book, The Reason I Jumped, get translated. And the bizarre thing is that mom came up with a similar thing where she used a kanji and her son, who is nonverbal. Exactly. So it's very, I do hope someday I can get in touch with him, because it's so strange. It's opened up this whole bizarre world where it seems like our son is a fully formed human being, but no one's listened to him before. He wrote last night, he said, I'm so proud to be your son. And he watched one of my launches because it was hybrid. My husband said, do you know what'll happen if Mommy's book does well? And he slowly typed out Money. I mean, he has a sense of humor. Yeah, so that's why we're so tired. He keeps wanting to type at night, and he's getting better. So my husband and I are taking our projects, and he went straight to book.
That's a lot to have going on during release week.
Isn't it? But so I'm gonna help him.
If he wants to write a book, he's going to, for sure.
I've been feeling so. I've written about him so much, and I don't want to. He can speak for himself now, and I'm really.
Oh my!
That's powerful.
That's brilliant. That's amazing.
It is amazing. So the power of language and books and reading. I mean, that's the thing. Like, we all read to our kids. People read to each other, and that's just. It can just unlock this whole world. Like, who knew? It
also bears witness to how, like, a lot of parents want to see results, but the actual thing about parenting is kind of letting go of the results. You do what you know might help, and then you hope that something surfaces later on, and yeah, that's a story of you put in the work, and then you get to maybe later see some dividends.
Hey, it's just like writing. It's just like writing. But actually, so Jason
for writers, everything is exactly like writing eventually.
But Jason was on Dr. Gupta's show, and they had a scene of me reading to him. You can see he looks like he's not listening. And he's really loud. And sometimes he gets super annoyed. But yeah, it's so interesting to think. He's like, no, I was listening. So. Yeah.
No, that's there's so many ways of listening. That's a very neurotypical way of listening, is to say, well, I'm sitting and I'm looking.
Right.
I mean, that's one thing that it can challenge you as a musician, is like, for some people, talking while they listen to music is how. That doesn't mean they're not listening. It's just what goes on, and they understand this in Italian opera as like, it's not quiet at a right. The notion of being quiet in the classical hall is a very new imposition on the idea. Now, having said that, I have shushed a million people while I play because I have those values, right? But there's a million ways to listen. There's a million ways to take in information. It doesn't mean someone's not listening if they're not looking at you. It doesn't mean someone's not listening if they're talking well. It depends on the person, right? So.
Fascinating.
So, thank you for asking that, because I'm dying to talk about it. And when, I wish Jake could be watching this, but we were trying to make sure that.
Well, he can rewatch it. He can just come on the link and watch it whenever he wants to.
Excellent.
So, and a bunch of times, because I'm going to rewatch it. So,
well, let's say I was watching this and I wanted to buy a copy of The Evening Hero by Marie.
Good question.
I just to read this outstanding book. Is there a link that I can click to buy this and benefit Books and Books right away?
Right down here in green. And if you're in Miami and you want to come by one of our stores, we have it there too. So thank you both.
Do click that link. This book will give you so much pleasure. And I mean, I don't know how many people know this, but when you buy a book the week it comes, no, my book came out in February. Don't worry about my book.
No, but that's a really good one too.
The thing is, like, when you buy a book the week it comes out,
yes.
it's the same with records. It makes a big difference to the author. So if you're intrigued and
does.
you have a little money to throw at a book, I recommend this one. It is a really good read. I can almost promise you. I mean, I don't, obviously, anybody watching, I don't know your tastes, but yeah, it's like it's a very entertaining and a captivating read that you will look forward to reaching to, which is kind of the highest thing I can say about a book. Because some books you work on and you go, I'm not ready for that book today. This does not happen with this book. It's plenty heavy, but at the same time, you can't wait to pick it up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
No,
John.
the pleasure was entirely mine. It's good to see you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Marie. Thank you to all of our viewers, and have a wonderful evening. And we will see you, hopefully see you in person in Miami soon.
Yeah,
Okay?
invite us both to Miami, then we can hang out. Me and John.
You're both invited. I think you're coming to the book fair. Are you not? Miami Book Fair? Sometime in November?
Me?
Yeah.
Not that I know of, but I'm not.
Well, we're going to work on that.
What happened, I wouldn't. Like, the thing is, my calendar is just so bonkers that if that was happening, I wouldn't know about it until October.
Okay, but you're on our list. That much I can tell you. You're on the authors to pursue list. So
All right.
So okay, so, and I know why from having listened to both of you. So thank you so much for being.
Thank you, and Marie, what a
Yay,
pleasure.
thanks for your work with books. Thanks, books. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
care.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.